but today I'm going to do something a little differently. What I would like you to do is imagine that in front of me there are a group of young women, and this is a long, long time ago. Here you are, again, just like every year. Look at you dressed in your mourning, ready to go into the mountains. Some of you have been before, but I see a few new faces. So before you go, I need to tell you why you go into the mountains every year. Because you do not go to celebrate. You go to mourn. I used to go, but now I'm too old. I can't climb into the hills. They're so rocky. But I can tell you. Let me tell you about that first year. That first year. She was my friend, you know, my sister. We grew up together. My father's home was just up the path from her home. We played when we were small children, and that year we had barely turned 13 and were betrothed. We were so excited, becoming young women. But that was the year her father, the judge of our people, led our men and our boys into battle against the Ammonites. The Ammonites are oppressors who sacrificed their little babies to that god, Molech. And her father gathered all of our men and went to battle. And they went and they fought and they returned victorious. But that day, the day they returned, Miriam and I, you see, she had a name, it was Miriam. Miriam and I were in her father's house talking about our betrothed. We were so excited. We were just talking about all those different things girls talk about. And I looked out the window and I saw them returning, and they were victorious. They were celebrating. And I said, Miriam, look, here they come. And I went out the door and I went up the path so that I could meet my father as he turned toward our home. And Miriam behind me ran to her father. And just as I reached my father, I heard the most horrible sound. And I knew something awful had happened. It wasn't long before we discovered what had happened. We found that before he went to battle, her father went before the place of sacrifice and on his knees begged God for victory and said, if I return in victory, I will sacrifice to you the first living thing that comes out of my home. And the first living thing was his daughter. How could he not know? How could he not know? Who did he think was going to meet him? A sheep? They were out with the shepherds. Of course, his daughter was going to meet him. And she, the dutiful daughter, how could she be a dutiful daughter? Said to him, Father, what you have promised God must be done. But only first let me go up with my friends into the mountains and bewail my virginity. Because, you know, then as now, it was shameful for a woman to go to her death without having born children. So the next day she gathered us and we went up into the mountains. There were 7 of us that year. And for 4 months we danced and we cried and we prayed and we promised her we would not forget. And when we came down from the mountain, her father took her hand and led her to the place of sacrifice. That year, I shamed my family. I refused my betrothed. How could I take for myself that which my sister was denied? And so each year I led a group of young women up into the mountains to remember her. I cannot go into the mountains anymore, but I still tell the story each year. I'm getting old now, and I won't be able to continue. One day it will be one of your tasks to tell this story. Because when I'm gone, if you do not, who will remember? No one. This story comes from the Hebrew scripture in the book of Judges, chapter 11, verses 29 through 40. It's a tough story, isn't it? Taken literally, this is the story of a man who made a promise to God and followed through on that promise, even though it meant killing his only beloved daughter. Unfortunately, unlike the story of Abraham and Isaac, where God provides an animal for sacrifice at the last minute, there is no replacement here. We rarely talk about texts like this one because we don't know what to do with them. Theologian Phyllis Trible calls this a text of terror, and it is. It is terrifying to consider a father who would promise God the life of another in return for military victory. Indeed, it is terrifying to imagine a God who would demand such a thing. In fact, an angel intervened in the sacrifice of Isaac and gave Abraham a ram to sacrifice instead. I believe this illustrates that God does not want the sacrifice of children. And yet here we have this story. The daughter of Jephthah is the only human sacrifice by an Israelite recorded in the text. What can it mean? The story of Isaac is often interpreted to reinforce the idea that one's faith in God should be so strong that we will do whatever God asks of us, no matter how painful it might be. And this story has been interpreted by some in a similar fashion. The problem with this interpretation is that nowhere in the scripture does God demand the sacrifice of this young girl. In fact, according to the story, because he was led into battle against the Ammonites, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. And in other words, he was already poised to win that battle. He didn't have enough faith in his own abilities, even strengthened by the Spirit. So he tried to make a deal with God. He didn't think it through the consequences of his rash promise. Among the Israelites, it was customary for the women to meet the victorious warriors with dancing and singing. Some commentaries point out that other animals that might have run out the door to meet him, such as a dog, would have been unclean and unacceptable as a sacrifice. It seems as though he should have known his daughter would be the one to meet him, doesn't it? Did he think God wanted him to sacrifice his daughter? If God didn't desire such sacrifice, why didn't someone intervene, like the angel in the story of Isaac? Some look at this story and see in it a warning about being careful what one promises God. Could be. Others look at the story and ask, what does it tell us about God? Many see foreshadowing of God the Father's sacrifice of his Son, Jesus. From that, they get a message that we should be willing to give God at least as much as God would give us, no matter the cost to us. Maybe. I would say, however, that this story tells us nothing about God and everything about humanity. It tells us about the way we can tell ourselves stories to support our own behavior or lack thereof. Jephthah's lack of faith in God and in his own abilities leads him to imagine that God would like him to make a sacrifice in order to maintain his reputation as a warrior and his position as a judge of the Israelite people. What a bitter irony. He leads his warriors into battle against the Ammonites, a people who sacrifice their infants to the god Moloch, only returning to sacrifice his own child. Why would he do this? I think Jephthah is more concerned about himself than he is about his daughter. He loves her, but only as much as she is worth to bring him success. I think this is a story of abuse and irresponsibility. Carla Baumbach, writing for the Jewish Women's Encyclopedia, points out that nobody in the community even tries to intervene for this young girl. It seems that nobody wants to interfere. Natalia Fernandez Marcos of the Centro de Ciencias Humanas y Sociales in Madrid did an in-depth study of this text in the ancient Greek. According to him, this text records the Aramaic Targumim, or rabbinic tales, that expand the Hebrew text and are written down in the 1st century AD. In this book, Marcos found a tradition that says that the daughter, who they call Sila, or the one who is demanded, went to the priests at the temple and begged them to release her from this fate, and they refused. It seems, however, that her father could have gone to them and paid a ransom, thus releasing himself from having to sacrifice his child. However, he never went to them for help. I repeat, I believe that this is a story of abuse. It is the abuse of a father against his daughter. It is the abuse of a community against a child. It is the kind of abuse that continues to this day. I'm not suggesting that there are many who promise God they will kill their children and follow through with that promise. Although in the past 10 years I can think of at least 3 instances where parents killed their children in dramatic and grisly ways because they believed God told them to. But no, most abuse is much less dramatic and has nothing to do with God. Scratch that. No abuse has anything to do with God. It has to do with us, and we are all accountable. I said earlier that I think the scripture says nothing about God and everything about humanity. And what I mean is that as humans, we are prone to believing that we are doing God's bidding, when in reality, we are only behaving in a way that will benefit us. We will go so far as to find scripture that we believe supports our behavior. We do this individually and corporately. Think of some of these scriptural statements taken out of context. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Wives, submit to your husbands. Spare the rod and spoil the child. Each of these texts from the Hebrew Bible has been used to commit heinous crimes against others. You might note that in Christian history, the first 2 have been specifically used to support violence against women. I mention this because March is Women's History Month, and this past Friday was International Women's Day. And while it is true that family violence is perpetrated against men by women, the instance of violence against women is statistically much higher. Most so-called witches who were killed during the Inquisition were women, and most domestic violence cases are perpetuated against women. The story of Jephthah's daughter is a story about an abused woman. It is also the story of an abused child. I was given this text from Judges as an assignment to tell the story that I told earlier, and I have to tell you that it was one of the hardest things that I've ever done. Stories like this are much easier to ignore than to face head on. It's difficult to deal with because if we look close enough, we can see ourselves in the story. We can see where we have made promises we can't possibly keep, where we've bargained with God using pawns that we have no business trading. We see ourselves sending our children off to war, sacrificing them not for the protections of our homes, but for our status and our way of life. And we see ourselves neglecting to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Perhaps we see ourselves as the one abused, remembering our own pasts and the many who did not speak up for us in our behalf. We'd rather turn our eyes away, pretend it never happened. But unless we speak up, we allow others to be heard. For you see, many can learn from our experience. We can help those who seek understanding. We are to be God's hands and feet in this world. We are to be the voice of those who cannot speak. God didn't intervene in the story of Jephthah's daughter because the people around her did not take responsibility. John Pattison, a friend of mine and a friend of Primera Iglesia, co-wrote a book called The Brothers Keepers. It's this true story of a family of young boys in Depression-era North Dakota who were abused and neglected by their single mother and ignored by their community. When the boys ended up disfigured and maladjusted, whose fault was it? The mother's? God's? Or was it the fault of the community who saw the neglect and said, "It's none of our business"? We are complicit in the abuse when we don't speak up, and we are part of the dawn of hope when we do. In 1864, a little girl named Mary Ellen was born in New York. Mary Ellen's father died when she was a baby, and by the time she was 2, her mother had boarded her with someone else so that she could go to work. As times got harder, her mother got behind on the payments for Mary Ellen's care, and the caregiver turned the little girl over to the Department of Charities, which in turn housed her with a couple without any proper paperwork. The foster father died soon after, and the foster mother remarried. The foster mother was extremely abusive, and she left the little girl disfigured, keeping her locked in a room most of her life. Eventually, a neighbor asked Etta Angel Wheeler, a caring Methodist mission worker who visited the impoverished residents of the tenements regularly, to check on the child. Etta went next door, pretending to seek help for the neighbor, and saw Mary Ellen herself. She was badly beaten and broken. Etta went to the authorities, but nobody wanted to intervene. After a while, and at her niece's suggestion, Etta turned to Henry Berg, a leader of the animal humane movement in the United States and founder of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, also known as the ASPCA. Finally, Etta found several neighbors who were willing to testify about the way Mary Ellen was treated. And in the end, it was the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals that rescued Mary Ellen and started the movement for a formalized child protection system. Mary Ellen went to live with Etta's mother in northern New York. And when Etta's mother died, her sister and her husband took Mary Ellen in. When Mary Ellen was 24, she got married, had 2 daughters of her own, and fostered a 3rd girl. She died in 1956 at the age of 92. Because of the intervention of neighbors and the persistence of one social worker, Mary Ellen lived a long and productive life. Her story was at the beginning of the movement to protect children throughout the world. Now, we might not be in a position where we can intervene in the life of someone who is in an abusive situation. Maybe we can't stop our leadership from making decisions that send our youth off to dangerous places. Maybe it's our place to help those who are in poverty or addiction. Maybe it is our place to help those who are ill. We can sit beside them or help someone who's having a bad day. Maybe our part is to pray for those who are in dark places of depression, who are suicidal, or who are in pain. Or maybe it is for us to pass on the stories of those whose lives have been short-circuited or ended because of violence or disease. Maybe it is up to us to simply remember, like the daughters of Israel once did for the daughter of Jephthah. Maybe it is up to us to dance, for if we do not remember, who will. Amen. Please join me in our prayer of brokenness and confession in the bulletin.